Ministry of Defense. Not MFA.
Okay, good afternoon everyone, and welcome to panel number 12, Transatlantic Link and the NATO-EU Cooperation. I'm a co-founder and director of strategy at the Council on Geostrategy, a London-based international policy think tank dedicated to generating a new generation geostrategic thinking for a more competitive age, and it's my pleasure to chair the session today. Russia's war against Ukraine has shown why NATO and the EU are both essential for European security. The blatant renewed assault of Ukraine by Russia has undoubtedly demonstrated the unity and the merits of Western cohesion. It has also revealed the potential and new opportunities for further NATO-EU cooperation. The two, of course, are different yet complementary models for ensuring the security of the continent. Therefore, at this session, we will aim to address the following questions. What will the NATO and EU interface look like in the future, and how do the NATO strategic concept and the EU strategic compass complement each other? How can we avoid duplicating policies and resources when it comes to European defense capabilities and NATO capabilities? And how can we simultaneously manage to pay enough attention to both the Indo-Pacific theater and the Euro-Atlantic theater? When discussing the importance of the cooperation between NATO and the EU, let's also try to look at it not only from a military perspective, but also to address other security-related issues from other parts of security spectrum. The issues we have sometimes touched on and other times discussed in a further detail yesterday and today in some of our panel sessions: energy security, economic security, and national and societal resilience. And I'm absolutely delighted to present an excellent panel today. We are joined by the following speakers: Ms. Simona COJOCARU, who is State Secretary from the Ministry of National Defense of Romania. We are also delighted to have with us today Ambassador Tacan İLDEM, Chairman of the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies. We are also joined online by Brigadier General Radostin, ILIEV, Director of the Defense Policy and Planning Directorate, Ministry of Defense of Bulgaria. We are also delighted to have with us today Mr. Emmanuel DUPUY, President of Institute for European Perspective and Security of France. And finally, we are joined by Mr. GODZIMIRSKI, who is a research professor at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. So, without any further delay, I would like to briefly introduce Ms. Simona COJOCARU, the State Secretary of Ministry of National Defense, who will be our first speaker today. And she has been working in the planning international relations and defense policy since 1997. And between 2013 and 2015 and 2017-2019, she was the director of the Directorate for Defense Policy. Ms. COJOCARU, we're looking forward to hearing your contribution.
Yes. So, good afternoon, everybody. It's Saturday evening. The weather is not so friendly, and we have so great audience here. I'm really very happy. And I'd like to start by congratulating the New Strategy Center for bringing us together on a Saturday evening. And also, now, at the end, however, at this wonderful forum, Black Sea and Balkan Security Forum, the congratulations are even, more welcomed by the New Strategy Center and all the partners. I'd like also to salute the distinguished panelists this evening. I'm really very glad to be with you. NATO-EU, Transatlantic Link, our topics very dear to my heart, because I'm a supporter, I'm a fan. Actually, these topics were amongst Romania's priorities for the presidency of the EU Council 3 years ago, and not only for the presidency of the EU Council, these are the guiding lines of our national policy as we are talking about defense, security, and foreign affairs. So, when addressing the NATO-EU cooperation and the importance of the transatlantic link, Romania has an objective opinion. We are now 18 years old member of NATO and 15 years old EU member states. And during these all years, we have always been an advocate, a strong one, a vocal one of the transatlantic link, saying all the time that this is of paramount importance. And these are not big words. This is about real things. NATO membership, with the advantages of the collective security and defense umbrella, and the commitments and specific obligations in this extent, represents, and this is very well known, one of the pillars of the fundamental triad of our national security alongside EU membership and the strategic partnership with the United States of America. Therefore, we are supporting the continuous adaptation and modernization processes at NATO and EU level. And what transformations we are witnessing exactly this year, 2022, a paramount, important, tremendously massive transformation at the level of the two organizations. And it is clear, ladies and gentlemen, that there is no time for institutional rivalry. No time anymore. Today, because today's geopolitical realities demonstrate us that only united we can face any kind of danger, any kind of threat, any kind of risk. The war of aggression against Ukraine, and I think each and every speaker throughout these days in this forum spoke about this war of aggression in Ukraine that started already 6 months ago, proves once again that Russia sees no restraint in using the military instruments of power in what it considers to be its legitimate spheres of interests. Russia has no respect for international law, for sovereignty, except for its own interests and vision about history of the world. It is an actor that lives and acts in a totally different political and historical dimension, governed by self-proclaimed and recognized fundamentals. But Russia poses a long-term threat to European, to Atlantic security. That's why I'm saying that there is no way but to cooperate between NATO and EU, and to furthermore increase our cooperation, because these two organizations have a crucial complementary role. And at the end of the day, as the war in Ukraine has already proved, Russia cannot be faced alone. This is crystal clear. This war attempted to destabilize the Western world, reshape the European order, and divide us in spheres of influence. And we can say that Russia counted on it. But our response was firm and united. Both EU and NATO allies have provided support to Ukraine since the beginning of the full-scale war. Strategic concept, the NATO strategic concept, marks a convergence how allies see Russia, which is now the most and direct and significant threat to the alliance. NATO summit in Madrid was a historic moment, indeed, by far, that provided the strategic framework for very important decisions in relation with NATO future, NATO adaptation and NATO transformation. I'm talking here, of course, about long-term adaptation of collective defense and deterrence. We welcome, of course, the decisions related to consolidation of the defense and deterrence on the eastern flank, Romania included, and the massive deployment of Allied Response Force. We also saw extraordinary foreign policy reversal. Just to name a few, Sweden and Finland decided to join NATO, and Denmark abolished its CSDP opt-out. These are important decisions to help strengthen the defense dimension at the EU level. Also, and I'm going to use many times during this intervention the word historic, because yes, we are living in a historic times, we took historic decisions, and so, my apologies. In a historic decision, the European Council granted Ukraine and Republic of Moldova the candidate status to become part of the European family and gave Georgia the perspective to become a member of the EU. Romania conducted intense démarches in this regard at all levels. NATO-EU strategic partnership is more robust and relevant than ever, and I will say it again, EU and NATO have gone through the most acute strategic challenges of the Euro-Atlantic space together. The history of cooperation is long, of course. We witness it. Some of us, few years, some more, but have seen both ups and downs. Let's be frank, let's be sincere. But cooperation between the two organizations has moved from simply desirable to vitally important. And our common resolve, again, proved how essential this partnership is. We should seize this opportunity. Really, we should seize this opportunity today and embark on a journey towards an enhanced cooperation, exploring new ways to deepen it. An increased cooperation on issues of common interest, such as, and I will give you only a couple of examples, military mobility, resilience, hybrid, the impact of climate change on security, emerging and disruptive technologies, women, peace and security agenda, and others. But what is happening now in Ukraine is also very much conventional, traditional, and classic. So we think that the two organizations should coordinate responses, should set even more higher level of ambitions, and by the way, the strategic compass adopted also this year set indeed a higher level of ambition for the EU, and in what we are calling a strategic reflection processes undergone at the level of the two organizations. So, to conclude, because I'm very much eager to find out also from my colleagues panelists this evening their views, their insights on the relationship, I'd like to say that it's important not only to defend our common values and interests, but to act together. Because now, today, we are not talking only about strategies, about reflection processes, we are talking about contributions on the ground, very real, very tangible, measurable. That's why, again, I will say that I'm really a supporter, I'm really a fan. I will always advocate that a stronger EU would also strengthen NATO. I really believe this is true. And moreover, I really think that we are stronger together. Thank you very much.
State Secretary COJOCARU, thank you so much for so excellently setting the scene for our discussion today. And now I would like to ask Ambassador İLDEM to make his contribution. And we'll just also would like to briefly introduce him. So Ambassador İLDEM is a senior Turkish diplomat. And since the start of his long career in 1978 till February 2021, he held bilateral and multilateral positions, including NATO Assistant Secretary General between 2016 to 2020. So Ambassador İLDEM, the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It is such a privilege and honor to be here today. I would like to thank New Strategy Center for the invitation and to include me on this panel. I salute all the individual panelists. And I'm also gratified to be part of a panel with relatively good gender representation, because this was something that I was observing throughout the conference. We need to encourage all of us to pay a bit more attention on gender representation, since you referred to.
Thank you very much.
Well, NATO-EU cooperation, although I'm coming from a country not member of the European Union, but member of NATO, I think given the threats and challenges that both NATO countries and EU countries face, it is not a choice but a real necessity for them to cooperate. And rightly so, it is qualified as strategic partnership. I don't want to dwell upon too much about the history of it, but I can only recall how the institutional partnership developed since the beginning of 2000s. One may recall 2002, when NATO and EU had a joint declaration on European security and defense policy, which led to Berlin Plus arrangements. So we have institutional foundations to promote this partnership. When I was Turkish ambassador to NATO from 2006 to 2009, I must say that we hadn't developed at that time a culture of working together. And there was some sort of a suspicion, more so in the EU side than NATO. We were always highlighting the importance of non-competing with each other, but there was some sort of a competition at the time. I remember how the flags on the NATO ships were changed to EU. Operation Atalanta was given way. It was some sort of an artificial embarkment of a project, but it was the necessity of the day. Now, if I recall my days as NATO Assistant Secretary General from 2016 to 2020, I can assure you that the level of cooperation and working relationship was uncomparable with the time that I served previously. I myself was coordinating with my counterparts every week on a regular basis. I recall 2016 Warsaw NATO summit, and during that time the three leaders, NATO Secretary General and chairpersons of the Council and the Commission, were able to sign a joint declaration which enabled both organizations to cooperate on 42 identified areas, which led to 2017 to add new cooperation areas to amount to 74 areas. And these are critical areas for both to cooperate closely. Now, since we also have a a very distinguished panelist from France, and since we know that strategic autonomy and France sometimes are identified as one important entity, I should dwell upon strategic autonomy of the European Union, although I'm not coming from a member state, as I alluded to earlier. I think strategic autonomy of the European Union is a good thing. Now you will get surprised, but I believe that if we interpret strategic autonomy to be strategic responsibility, we can applaud the European Union for doing so. But I also sensed during my interaction with a number of allied nations that they were a bit scared, even those within the European Union, whether such a project would dilute the meaning and importance of transatlantic link, which you refer to and which you find it close to your heart, and not only to Romania, but to many nations within NATO. And I think everybody was speculating what would be the reflection process of the European Union while developing the strategic compass. And there were certain fears whether some ideas to boost the ambition of strategic autonomy would be in place after Afghanistan, after the AUKUS Pact. But I must say that when I read 47-page strategic compass document, it's a good document, but I must say it is like an action plan rather than a strategic vision statement. And I found the ambitions of European Union elaborated within the strategic compass to be rather relatively modest than expected, which is good. I mean, now I would like to outline 3 points. In order NATO-EU strategic partnership to be serving to both organizations and members of these organizations, we need to be careful about 3 things. First, both organizations, and especially the European Union, should be cognizant of the fact that NATO remains as the cornerstone of European defense. Second, when we talk about the very complex challenges, threats that we are facing, Russian war in Ukraine, to be the first and foremost to talk about, it is essential that we have enough capabilities. In terms of capability development, I think the European Union has made great strides in recent time, which is applaudable, and it also reinforces the defense capabilities of NATO, since we are talking about complementarity, non-competing with each other. This is very important. But to complete the circle, the third point is if we really mean business and if we really want to create capabilities, and these include strategic enablers and next generation weapon systems, then the European Union should be also open-minded in fully involving non-EU allies in projects like European Defence Fund and PESCO. This is essential, otherwise EU would be missing an important source of capability for its own use. This brings me to my last point, because I don't want to prolong my initial intervention. We were talking about Berlin Plus in the past. Now I think it is also time for us to talk about reverse Berlin Plus. Plus provided European Union to have an assured access to NATO means and capabilities. Since EU would be better off in creating defense capabilities, then if there is any necessity, NATO should be also able to have an assured access to EU capabilities. Thank you.
Ambassador İLDEM, thank you so much for sharing your important insights based also on your personal experiences during your time in NATO. And I would like to ask to contribute our next panelist, Mr. DUPUY. As well, Ambassador referred in his speech to France and also to your presence here today. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mrs. Chair. Of course, I'm not speaking on behalf of France. My think tank is based in France, but I'm not in an official capability. Before starting the panel, and I'm thanking you because you raised 3 questions that I'd like to answer precisely. I have 2 preliminary points. This morning, a French colleague of mine saying, is it really the time to speak or to think about the future architecture, the confidence and security architecture of Europe, as the house is burning? I will raise that question in a different manner, saying that we already have the basis and the plan. If we start looking at what we drafted in Budapest, the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, security, territorial integrity in regards to denuclearization and demilitarization, namely concerning Belarus, already Ukraine and Kazakhstan, we have a starting point. Then we can shift to the June 2009 Corfu process, in which we already put the possibility of bridging OSCE, European Union, and NATO, let's say, overall grand strategy to build a, I will say it in French because our French president says it very sufficiently and very frequently, une architecture de paix et de sécurité et de confiance. But maybe the question has to be put in taking another time frame, saying that the architecture of security as well today will of course not look like the architecture in 2030 and maybe later on. We do have 21 European Union members inside NATO. We may have 23 among 32, but we may very well, assessing the fact that the last 19th of July, Albania and North Macedonia made a step towards European Union, we may very well have 25 European Union members inside a 32 NATO capability. This could change or put more Europeanization or put more liaison or to liaise more between the NATO 2030 strategic concept and the strategic compass. Second point, and then I will kick off to respond to your questions, very acute questions. I think a peace agreement, a ceasefire is a starting point, but it's not a final point. I think President Recep Tayyip Erdogan mentions this very frequently. Making peace between Ukraine and Russia is an absolute necessity, but we have to look forward. What will be the way Europe and its neighbor face the century to come? Not only on the eastern flank, but on the southern flank, and maybe on a broader neighborhood. I will come to that afterwards. So, you raised 3 questions. How will NATO, Europe interface, look like Australia and Japan? Thus, I will have 3 strategic dimensions and maybe 3 comments on the obstacles to overcome. First of all, how can we avoid the overlap capabilities when it comes to capabilities, policies, and resources in a very special moment, a cash-strained agenda, an oil and gas crisis, winter is already there, and of course, a very tight calendar and an agenda when we are rediscovering the capacity or the need to have a full-fledged military capacity when, in some cases, We were only thinking about a cross-sanctions armies, and I will pinpoint a bit more on that. To be honest, before the 24th of February invasion, no one was really, let's say, ambitious about the common indirect fire system, when now everyone is seeking to have more artillery pieces. I think I may have heard that Romania is looking to buy 88, 90 tracked, self-propelled howitzer. Maybe the French proposition, I think, is the best for you. This is my way of putting a message, Mrs. Minister. So the question that I want to focus on is saying that we have to, of course, take in consideration that what is of a constant political will to go into an economy of war is very difficult because our military providers are not ready for that. The French Minister of Defense, Sébastien Lecornu, mentioned the fact that we have to raise the number from 77 that we have in our French army. It takes a lot of time, 1 year to build, not more than 3 or 4 that goes out of the production chain every month. That's my first point concerning this question. Then, when it comes to building a strong military diplomatic capacity, both inside the European Union and inside NATO, then comes another question. How do we take advantage of the states who belong to each organization, or one or the other organization? And that brings me to bring out a French geopolitical concept, the notion of strategic depth. Each country has a geographical, historical dedication to an area. Of course, obviously, wider Black Sea for you, and obviously for us, our southern pillar, Mediterranean integration, Euro-African cooperation, not to mention our military dedication on sub-Saharan Africa. That's one of the answers. In order to not overlap, take the capability that some states, some nations among NATO and among European Union can bring about in a sort of specialization. When it comes to European Union Latin approach, this is the case for Portugal, Spain, France, Italy, and of course Greece, not to mention, not to forget Turkey. That's maybe one of the cooperation we can have together. We can go along and have and share a common perspective on the Libyan political stability, for example. Euro-African, I will not elaborate more, Germany, France, and Italy, but of course, as we are here, Balkans, Black Sea, and again, you are doing this in Romania. The Bucharest 9 is something we can build on. I heard in the previous panel that Ukraine must be part of the BAPS, the Black Sea, well, Baltic, Adriatic, and Black Sea perspective. These are just examples. Again, enhanced forward presence is important, and this was committed in Madrid for Eastern flank, but it will also be important when it comes to tackle the questions that arise in the southern flank, counterinsurgency, fight against piracy, of course, against jihadist terrorist armed groups, and of course, as well, high density awareness, important in Africa as well as it is important on the European soil. My third point, and I will be more brief, Mr. Chair, considering the fact that neither NATO nor, well, NATO Agenda 2030, nor the strategic compass is sufficient to respond to the next future generation of conflict or the wider European security architecture. Maybe it's time to invent something else. And this was proposed by France, by President Emmanuel Sarkozy, the 9th of May, during the end, almost the end of the French presidency, with the Communauté Politique Européenne, the European political community. I was very happy to know that the Czech Republic will put that at the agenda in the next October meeting in Prague, hoping that it will not have the same fate as the previous proposition made by François Mitterrand, who precisely proposed this in the 1990s and, of course, did not follow up after the June 1991 Prague meeting, again, having this proposition to speak with countries who are outside of Europe, who went outside of Europe, Great Britain, but to speak to countries who are not yet inside European Union. I'm looking in Turkey. Just to wrap up, 3 basic, very core and simple ideas. What NATO has less legitimacy to do, because this was not written in the April 1949 Washington Treaty, European Union should do it. You mentioned PESCO, you mentioned, I added, or I'm adding the European Peace Facility, which offers a capability or a possibility to work with third nations amongst NATO in the first time, but maybe outside of NATO. We should add, I could add, you mentioned PESCO, I already mentioned that. We could add as well the European Defense Action Plan, which exists from 2016. Second idea, to deter Russia's narrative, we have to invent our own narrative. Because Russian narrative is strong, and Russian narrative is convincing for certain parts of the world. And this will be very clear during the next 77th General Assembly of the United Nations. Indivisibility of security, challenge to multipolarity, de-occidentalization of the world, post-Atlantic leadership, questions over global diplomatic agenda, or interrogation of whether or not rules-based world order is the only system in which democracies, liberal democracies, can work together. In order to counter this narrative, we have to reinvent our own narrative and be very sure of the values, very sure of the military capacity, very sure about the unity and the capability we have to deter Russia. We must just, therefore, shift to from duplication, to a more comprehensive cooperation. Besides Article 5, which I think will be not used in the near future, we also have to propose alternative Article 42.7, Article 222 of the Lisbon Treaty is a strong commitment in the way soft power, in the way normative powers inside Europe, in the way smart diplomacy, agile diplomacy, as President Emmanuel Macron mentioned a few days ago during this, his speech to the ambassador, can be a counter model or a complementary model. Third, last point, what new security architecture? Because the questions to be taken in consideration are not only linked to Ukraine. We have had a crisis during the 10th revision conference of the non-proliferation treaty. Of course, it is not only because Zaporizhzhia was mentioned, but it's also because there is pressure concerning the nuclear ban treaty, there is pressure concerning the New START treaties, and of course the enlargement, not only considering Russia and the United States, but maybe tomorrow China. Final point, are we ready, or should we be prepared for a new 1991 Paris Conference on European Security, a new Helsinki model based on confidence-built rules, based on regional cooperation, mind-linked partnership, and, of course, offering a new security model. We already failed, I mentioned this in Corfu in 2009, but that doesn't mean that we cannot achieve it. One last point. If peace comes after this 6 months dreadful war, we have to draw the lines with our systemic rivals, but of course, sometimes not forgetting that they may, in some cases, be our systemic adversaries. This is the case with a certain number of countries. I'm not looking in Turkey in particular. I know that my French president has sort of dilemma with Turkey, but I was mostly thinking of India. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. DUPUY, for so comprehensively addressing all three key questions on which our today's discussion is based. And now I'm absolutely delighted to invite Brigadier General ILIEV, who's joining us today online, to provide us a military perspective on this topic of transatlantic link and the NATO-EU cooperation. And Brigadier ILIEV is the Director of the Defense and Policy and Planning Directorate of Ministry of Defense of Bulgaria. He has had an illustrious military career, and after being promoted to Brigadier General, he assumed the position of Director of the Bulgarian Defense Staff in June 2018, which was his last position prior to the current assignment in 2019. So Brigadier General ILIEV, we are looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Ms. STARYCH, for this kind introduction, and thank you also for the opportunity to take part in this distinguished panel and to address the agenda topic title and to answer the questions answered as initially stated. I think the momentum of the new fundamentally change in the context of war in Ukraine security environment is to pay an increased attention to the security and defense issues. And I would like to start with clarifying that our position is permanent, firm, and clear. Bulgaria supports the sovereignty, territorial integrity, internationally recognized borders, including territorial waters of Ukraine. And at the same time, we condemn categorically Russia's unprovoked and unjustified war. And I'm saying this because the war leads us to a world situation of growing instability with increased conflict potential regionally and globally. And I will say it has serious long-term implications and also no simple solutions. So until Russia stops its aggression, we should sustain our support to Ukraine. In addition, the war threatens the security of all of us. It constitutes a real threat to the Euro-Atlantic security and could lead to destabilization of the Black Sea and Western Balkan regions as well. Needless to say that potential spillover will affect the member states of NATO Eastern Flank. And this is all direct challenge to NATO and EU, and we must deal with it as an indivisible part of Euro-Atlantic family of democratic nations. That is why transatlantic link and solidarity are needed more than ever, and our response should be collective, decisive, and also rapid, I would say. At this point, I would like to stress one additional remark that we generally support a relevant increase of Allied presence in the Black Sea. And also, we support the Euro-Atlantic integrations of all countries from the whole region. We consider this the best remedy against any kind of Russian subversive influence. And that's why both EU and NATO open doors and integration processes are definitely of our interest. Going to the transatlantic link, I agree with the previous speaker that it's unique and important. It's a frame which works in two directions, both sides of the Atlantic, and I agree definitely not just to security, defense, and crisis management, but also in the areas such as economic relations, trade and commerce, history, cultural, political, and social relations. This is a bond which is a strong foundation on which our collective security is built. And since the US is a leading player in NATO and as well as bilaterally engaged with a number of nations within the area, security depends heavily on it. Even more, I would say it's a key factor of the context in which European security and defense cooperation will need to find the right answers, ways, and means to tackle with the current challenging security environment. Therefore, I agree fully with Ms. COJOCARU that strengthening the transatlantic relations will for sure help our efforts to bring more regional security and stability as well. In this regard, we welcome the recent initiative of the US Congress, the Black Sea Security Act of 2022, on the elaboration of the Black Sea Development and Security Strategy. And coming to the NATO-EU cooperation, I would support the previous speaker that it is determined, unique, essential, but also strategic for both organizations, and especially after the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Given the fact that both NATO and EU accepted crucially important strategic documents earlier this year, such as new strategic concept and strategic compass, in both documents, the strength of the NATO-EU cooperation is duly reflected. So while NATO recognizes the value of stronger and more capable European defense that contributes positively to the transatlantic and global security, the EU aims to further increase the strategic partnership through more structured political dialogue as well as operational and thematic cooperation. The areas vary, and in my point of view, the question here is, what are the priorities? And how do we plan to tackle them? Some priorities have been identified already, such as resilience, emerging and disruptive technologies, hybrid threat, cyber threats, military mobility, joint exercise, support of partners. And this is just in parallel to the 74 joint measures, and also in addition to the support of regions of strategic importance, such as Black Sea and Western Balkans. Definitely, NATO and EU should continue to complement and mutually reinforce each other in the future. And we nationally support the ongoing work on the next third joint declaration to be signed soon. To wrap up in this area, I believe that effective close future cooperation between NATO and the EU is indispensable and must become their second nature. Such kind of cooperation, together with cooperating with the United Nations, is of paramount importance to protection of the international law and international rule-based order. And I think the progress here is up to successful implementation of the ambitious goals and tasks as set in the strategic concept and strategic compass as well. Meanwhile, while working together, our immediate task is to stay united in the face of the grave threat of the European security. And I agree that it's our unity that make difference and that can deter any aggressor. To conclude, I have selected a proverb to quote, and this is that any alliance is only as strong as its members. And speaking nationally, being member of NATO and EU, we would like to appreciate stronger, both of them. This is how we could add more value to the security-related infrastructure and would be better prepared for any challenges of the future. And finally, if we are to succeed in building up the NATO eastern flank strong enough, that means we must invest enough in our defense capabilities and make all the regional allies and partners resilient enough as well. Thank you very much, and I will be happy to answer any questions you might have. Back to you, Mr.
Brigadier General ILIEV, thank you so much for your contribution. And Mr. GODZIMIRSKI, so we touched on military security cooperation, but I also in my introductory remarks mentioned a couple of other issues we haven't discussed in depth yet. So, namely energy security, economic security, national and societal resilience, all these security-related issues from other parts of the security spectrum. I'm sure, keeping in mind your experience, as have been working on Russian foreign and security policy issues for more than 20 years, years, paying special attention to the role of energy resources in Russian grand strategy, among other matters. You will be able to enlighten us on these matters as well today.
Thank you very much. I would like to start with expressing my deep gratitude to NST for being invited. When I was invited, I was very glad because this was something that provided a good opportunity for us to somehow restart our cooperation between our institutes, between New Strategy Center and our institute. We were happy to be involved in joint cooperation on various aspects of European security since 2020, but due to COVID, we were somehow prevented from developing this cooperation in the way we wanted. And then this invitation compelled me also to look into two documents that form somehow basis for the current debate in Europe, the EU Compass 2022 and strategic concept of NATO proposed in also 2022. And those two, my take on those two documents was that I wanted to learn what is the kind of official narrative and where are the overlaps and what this can tell us about the possibility of those two institutions, organizations working together on addressing problems that they have identified as the main issues to be addressed. There is a long list of challenges and threats those two organizations have identified in those two official statements on the current situation, including things like climate change and so on. But there is one question that is identified as the top priority and top challenge and top threat to be dealt with. This is the return of the power politics in Europe, formulated as return of war to Europe as the main issue. Those two documents have also identified not only the threats and the risks, but also who are the main challengers who pose the threat to European security. And it's not a surprise to see that Russia is defined as the top challenger, top competitor, top source of threat. Russia is described as a country that shattered peace in Europe, that a country that altered security environment is those official statements. But also China is definitely identified as a source of challenge, although the statements on China are less somehow strong than on Russia. But China is also identified as a country that works together with Russia on undermining the rules-based order, which means that there is also this Chinese connection to what is happening nowadays in relations to Russia. And as said, those two documents have rightly so identified Russia as the major source of threat. And when reading those documents, when looking at how they define the current set of threats to be dealt with, we also need to understand what kind of issues need to be addressed immediately in short-term perspective, mid-term perspective, and long-term perspective to deal with those threats and to somehow counter the malign activities of those countries that are identified as the main challenges. When it comes to those issues that need to be addressed, I decided to build on what General Hodge said yesterday. He identified 4 things that Russia, that is in those official documents identified as the main source of threat, needs to do in order to somehow be able to reduce the risks and the negative implications of its involvement in the war in Ukraine. Then General Hodge said that Russia needs some time to regroup, to relaunch its war in Ukraine, that Russia needs to prevent any revolt at home, because this would somehow pose a threat to the security of the current regime, that Russia needs to do something to stabilize its economy, and that Russia needs to do something to rebuild its military capabilities. And from the perspective of both NATO and EU, what is important is to prevent Russia from achieving those four objectives. Those objectives have both short, mid, and long-term perspectives, but it's important looking at the situation from the EU and NATO perspective to prevent Russia from achieving those goals, meaning that we should not let Russia regroup and relaunch its war in Ukraine. This is definitely a very short-term goal, because if we don't react today, then the situation is going to change. We need to somehow provide some support to those forces within Russia that want to work for the changing of to change the regime. We need to prevent Russia from achieving the goal of stabilizing its economy, meaning that we should continue using various types of instruments we have at our disposal to destabilize Russian economy, and then we should also use all the available instruments of power to prevent Russia from rebuilding its military capabilities in the longer term perspective. And then when we look at what NATO and the European Union can do, we need to understand what kind of instruments of power those two organizations have at their disposal and what they are best at doing. Traditionally, we think about instruments of power as being related to diplomacy, informational space, military instruments, and economic instruments of power. But then there is also this other idea that those instruments can be defined as military, informational, diplomatic, but also financial instruments are definitely in the play. There are also some intelligence-related issues that need to be addressed and can be addressed by both NATO and European Union. Economic instruments are definitely something that can be used in order to influence the situation. Legal instruments are also in the game. And then there is also this issue of developmental instruments. And I would like to underline that this question of developmental instruments is very important, not necessarily at the current stage, but in the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine and so on. And then we need to understand what EU is best at and what NATO is best at in order to somehow secure a rational division of labor between those two organizations. And we know that EU has various types of power at its disposal. It's about normative power that is also shared to a very large extent with NATO, because NATO is also an organization built on certain values and norms. It's about EU regulatory power that has been used and is being used and is going to be used in order to regulate EU relations within the EU, but also with external actors. Then EU is definitely a huge market power, because it's the biggest economic union in the world that is very attractive for other countries to cooperate with in various market-related questions. And then EU is also an economic power per se, because market power, for instance, EU is the most important global importer of energy, so this gives EU a lot of power to influence those who are interested in supplying energy to Europe. On the other hand, EU is also very much dependent on energy coming from outside. And then when it comes to NATO, it's definitely military power that is important, and NATO has also provided and is going to provide Ukraine and other actors with intelligence input. And it's important also to look at what are the constraints influencing this possible improvement in cooperation between those two actors. The issue of EU search for greater strategic autonomy as a challenge was already mentioned. There is also the fear that if we do not coordinate cooperation between the EU and NATO, we will face the question of doubling and overlapping military capabilities, which would not be very rational in that situation. Then being important international organizations, it's also very important to prevent what is quite often referred to as institutional competition, because those two organizations have their own somehow organizational identities. And then there is also an issue that needs to be addressed, the issue of certain level of anti-American sentiment in various countries in Europe, which can also prevent better coordination of efforts between NATO and the EU. And then there are also some national idiosyncrasies that can also put some constraints on the cooperation. We have the issue of how to make German policymakers understand that Germany is not only, should not be on the civilian power, but also should invest in its military. This has already happened after the Zeitenwende that was announced days after the intervention. Then there is this issue of how to place France in this context. France has its special understanding of its role both in Europe and globally. Then there is the issue of how to address the question of British and American exceptionalism, and then there is also the question of some countries within both NATO and EU that do not live to those normative expectations, which needs also to be addressed if we want to have a kind of smooth cooperation between EU and NATO. And then there is also a number of questions that need to be addressed immediately. And after looking at those two documents, I identified the question of resilience that is mentioned 45 times in the EU document and 12 times in NATO document as an issue that needs to be addressed. And then there is also this immediate need to address the question of energy security in Europe. And here we see that the EU is very much preoccupied with this because there are 12 mentions of energy in the EU document and 6 mentions of the EU energy security in NATO document. And we have also seen that when faced with those immediate challenges, EU and NATO can cooperate, because we see that the issue of energy security is being addressed, amongst other, by greater supply of LNG coming from the other side of the Atlantic, and the issue of resilience is the key topic discussed both in EU and NATO. And last but not least, we should also understand, as Mr. DUPUY has underlined, that the majority of EU members are also NATO members, and the majority of NATO members are also EU members, which would create a lot of synergies when those two organizations are supposed to work together on addressing those issues. And last but not least, it's also positive to see that we have two leaders leading those two organizations, Jens Stoltenberg and Ursula von der Leyen, who have somehow established a very direct and very good dialogue in order to address those questions at the top level. So I will stop here and hope very much that we will have the opportunity to address some important questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. GODZIMIRSKI. Now, I'm conscious of the time, but I'm also aware of the fact that we began our session 15 minutes later, and I'm hopeful that we will be giving next 15 minutes for the Q&A session. So I encourage everyone in the audience to ask their question, but please just make sure to emphasize your name, your role, and to whom you are addressing your question. Any volunteers? Right, well, to all of the audience, I will then ask a question. We have not touched on the fact that the UK has recently left the EU, but it is, of course, one of the most influential members of NATO, and also is Europe's preeminent military power, who has demonstrated, leading European support to Ukraine in this war. So my question would be, and perhaps Mr. DUPUY, we could start with you, how do we connect the European Union and the UK?
Well, it is already connected. That is on regards of PESCO. In November 2010, we signed the Lancaster House Agreement for 50 or 90 years. I don't remember. I think it was for 50 years. Combining a non-EU member to a EU member, France and Great Britain. Very important, as this has launched a military cooperation when it comes to torpedoes, MBDR, when it comes to having a common view or common perspective or a pooling and sharing capacity when it comes to submarines. And of course, this is important because Great Britain and France have the same dedication, not only for Black Sea strategic autonomy or Black Sea strategic awareness, but Indo-Pacific awareness. I'm not saying that we are the only two European nations to have this perspective, but we are the two European nations to still have lands and sea to defend and to protect. So this brings us to have this compilation of capacity. This was very clear during the 22 of February 1st EU Indo-Pacific meeting in Paris under the French presidency. So that's one example. Another example is saying that we have to have capability, whether they are from European Union or whether they are from NATO, CSDP mission or NATO-based external operation, when it comes to threats that we are assessing for a long time. Counterinsurgency, fight against piracy, the fight against criminalization of migration, the fight between, or the capacity or the need, the urgent need to understand or to pinpoint the nexus or the interconnectivity between grand criminality and terrorist organization. These are subjects on which we can build together, both with Great Britain, both with the European Union, and I should add, with neighboring countries in the south. And this is why it is so important to understand, and I think this was very clear in Madrid, when the Spanish Minister of Defense and the Spanish Prime Minister made it very clear that NATO also must be present in the south flank of the Mediterranean Sea and in sub-Saharan Africa. These are some examples. I would add maybe a third example, and it's very important to assess the fact that military capacity is one thing, but then you have to have diplomatic common perspective. And as we belong to a certain number of organizations, G7, European Union, NATO, as we are dedicated to fulfill what is now a reality, since 66 countries have signed the nuclear ban treaty, we do have a certain number of work to be done together inside the Security Council. Just some elements.
Thank you very much, Mr. DUPUY, for a detailed answer. State Secretary KOJOCARU.
Very short. UK is still in Europe, isn't it? So we are talking about European security. Russia attempted to hamper European security and Atlantic security and stability and to recreate dividing lines. So UK has an important role in relation with European security. Such an important contributor should continue to be an important partner for EU, being also a very prominent role in NATO, and we have witnessed lately how massively UK helped Ukraine, and also all the debates and all the results that NATO achieved in relation with consolidation of deterrence and defense on the eastern flank, throughout the eastern flank, and not only, also for the southern flank and so on. I would like also to say, Ambassador, that I have a couple of witnesses here in this framework, in the audience, that listened when I used to say that strategic autonomy should be strategic responsibility. I was really amazed listening to you, and this is the key word, and I think UK is part of this strategic responsibility in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, State Secretary. Ambassador İLDEM.
I certainly agree that the United Kingdom should contribute to the European Union's efforts. But this brings me again back to my point that non-EU allies, NATO allies, should be fully involved in consultations, in cooperative schemes. I refer to PESCO and European Defence Fund, but you added one more element. This is essential, and this is a long-standing promise of the European Union, which has never been delivered properly. I remember when I was ambassador to NATO in 2008, when we had the Georgian war, I insisted that Turkey should be consulted by the European Union. And my pleas fell to the deaf ears at that time. Now, if you allow me, there are a few points that I would like to perhaps add my perspective. I think it would be essential to keep NATO as the unique and essential transatlantic consultation forum. This is very important. Why? And I think President Macron made a good service to NATO with his statement on brain death. Why? He was complaining that his country was not consulted within the context of Syria when the United States was unilaterally withdrawing forces, when Turkey was initiating a cross-border operation. So he didn't like to be sidelined. You referred to certain geographies that France has interest. Syria is one of them, I think. And he said brain dead. But one thing he forgot at that time was that it was, ironically, France with a long-standing position to object certain topics to come to NATO consultation forum. It was Turkey insisting that Syria should be discussed at NATO, and it was not accepted. So when I put the question as member of NATO 2030 expert group to Minister Le Drian, whether his country's position has changed, I couldn't get a response, but later on, at the higher levels at the ministry, I was assured that it was the policy of the past. From now on, they would be more open to consultations, which I welcome. I hope that NATO will remain as an essential and unique forum of transatlantic consultations. Now, reference to clause 42.7 and 222, of course, in the European Union context, these clauses could be referred to. But I don't think that in NATO-EU cooperation, they could be substitute to Article 5, and I don't want to have any statement which may dilute the importance of Article 5. Article 5 is ironclad commitment of allies to one another. And we cannot rule out the possibility of the invocation of Article 5. Think of 2001. Nobody was expecting any contingency in which Article 5 would be invocated, but we had Twin Towers 9/11 attacks. So we should separate those concepts for the better use of what NATO and EU could offer. As to the deconfliction of certain capacities of both organizations, as independent experts group, we also dwelled upon it. And we thought that it would not be proper to make such a deconfliction because when you read strategic compass of the European Union, it tries to restrict NATO within the bounds of collective defense, whereas NATO has 3 core tasks, the other 2, crisis management and cooperative security. Therefore, NATO cannot give up its main tasks in those 2 areas. What they could do is to have transparency, proper coordination, timely consultations. And on China, I think both organizations are on the same page. Russia and terrorism are 2 main threats. China is not a threat. It does not pose a direct military threat right now. It is a challenge with some opportunities as well. If we read the declaration of NATO leaders of 2019 in London, it talks about China for the first time, and it refers to it as a challenge, but also an opportunity. You mentioned new security architecture pertaining to Europe, but if we take in global sense, many of the arms control regimes are not functioning. And definitely China should be part of the new architecture. And if we can induce them in any negotiating process, then it could be, provide us an opportunity. Climate change and its impact on security would be yet another area. One last thing on how both organizations acted vis-à-vis the unfolding situation in Ukraine, the Russian war in Ukraine. I think the unity of the West has been demonstrated solidly. I recall on the 24th of February, Stoltenberg meeting Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel, and it was a significant demonstration of timely coordination between the two organizations. I think more joint visits, more joint statements could reinforce this image of working together. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador İLDEM. And I've been given a sign that we have just 2 more minutes left. So may I ask Mr. GODZIMIRSKI and Brigadier General ILIEV to give their concluding remarks.
I will be very short. Coming from a country that is not a member of the European Union but is a founding member of NATO, I see that there should be adopted a very pragmatic approach to both cooperation between non-members and members and between those two organizations, because the nature of threats and risks that we face today is not something that can be dealt with by one of those organizations. We need to adopt the broad understanding of security, and we see that the Russian kinetic warfare in Ukraine has also implications in other areas of security, energy security, resilience, health, you name it, migration, and so on and so on. So those questions need to be addressed in a comprehensive manner, and to address them in a comprehensive manner, we need to improve the level of cooperation between members and non-members who face the same type of challenges, and between those two organizations they play a crucial role in securing peace and development in Europe and in the transatlantic area. So this is my final call to those who are responsible for shaping those policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. GODZIMIRSKI. And Brigadier General ILIEV?
Okay, right. I would argue regarding the question about UK that the country was never disconnected from the security point of view, because we are talking here about the same area. Of course, when it's come to the Black Sea and Balkans, it's our home, and I must say the British embassies was always active and always in support of like-minded and regional initiatives in both regions. Another way to show the bridge of connection, it was the Berlin Plus format and the still ongoing cooperation Althea, and we are considering right now a future, how to develop, how to keep, how to revitalize, and I'm sure the UK is still playing a vital role there, and being Deputy Commander in shape, UK General Officer, generally he is responsible and for the commanding, planning, conceptually, etc., military point of view, all related issues regarding the implementation of the operation. Then maybe another very strong point to underline that connection is any areas which have been pointed out earlier about strategic partnership between EU and NATO. Any of them is a separate bridging UK with the rest of the countries. And just to conclude, since we are all talking about single set of forces, single sort of resources, it's very important in the current situation just to stay united and to implement those strategic documentation we have talking about earlier. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brigadier General ILIEV. And unfortunately, our time is up, but I hope that you enjoyed this panel discussion, and I would like to ask everyone to give a round of applause to our panelists today and thank them for their contributions.